Okay, you're live.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon to talk about this. Everybody's here. Everybody's here. Good. The subject is our emergency ordinance. At this point, this ordinance was 90 days from the writing from our first reading and 60 days from the second reading. It reflects an accumulation of changes that have taken place throughout 2020. And I guess most specifically in this version, it really reflects some of the changes that have taken place at the state and the governor's emergency changes. I talked with Stephanie. I think the ordinance at this point now, looking at it now and reflecting back on, the reasons why we wrote it back when, it seems cumbersome. There's a lot of words, there's a lot of language in there. And I think it's become kind of hard to explain. And I think as we've moved further and further away from the changes that the governor made 90 days ago, it's somewhat exacerbated than when we reflect back in terms of talking about his changes. So I was talking with Stephanie, and we thought it may be a good idea to get our group together again to talk about this, to see what, if any, changes that we wish to make substantively, if not anything major, possibly at the least, put it into a more condensed version, somewhat that may be a little bit more straightforward relative to its explanation. We make reference to the fact that anyway, that was the purpose, to see what, if anything, we wanted to do. And Joe and Stephanie were kind enough to walk us through that to see. If we come to some conclusions today that would give, or at least some, maybe not the conclusions, but probably better said, maybe directions today to Joe and Stephanie, then they in turn can take the opportunity of this next week to put some language together of an ordinance that reflects what we talked about. And then we could pass on it Tuesday at council meeting. So that's the agenda. There really isn't an agenda per se in terms of anything, other than what I've said. It's just to look at this document and see what, if anything, we want to change to it. So Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you or to Joe.
Okay, yeah, I'll let Joe kind of walk through. He and I talked about it. And just so that there's things in here that the governor may have given direction or authority to municipalities to enforce. There's things that the governor may have, at one time, it used to be a requirement, but now he strongly recommends it, but we still keep it as a requirement. So Joe and I were talking, and one of the things I would like to do, because I think there's sometimes some confusion in the community, especially when they hear the governor's office and certain restrictions have been lifted and they're not understanding why we still have them in place, or we're referencing orders of the governor that have been lifted, but we're still making a requirement. And I think Joe it's a great idea, so I'll let him walk through. It's really just to clean this up. So if you all decide that, hey, we like, for the most part, everything that's in here, we don't want to make any changes, I think just cleaning this up. So next week we will bring to you, ideally what we would do is we would essentially kind of repeal the current one that's in place and adopt a new one, and Joe make sure that we have the effective date right, so that we're not without any type of regulation if you as council decide to keep something in place. So Joe, if you want to give anything quick before we turn it over to council in case they have any questions, please feel free to elaborate.
Yeah, if I could, I'd just like to briefly outline where the state is right now so everyone understands what is in place from the state's point of view. And this is an order from March 5th. It hadn't changed since March 5th. I'm just going to go through the topics of relevance. With regards to masks, The state does not require masks, but strongly encourages their use in public places. They do, well, okay, they don't even require it in government facility. Well, they do require it in government facilities, but there's a long list of exceptions. There's also language in the mask section encouraging or stating that local municipalities are free to enact their own mandatory mask ordinance. The other relevant section is on restaurant operations. Again, the governor has gone to voluntary regulations there. I hereby urge any and all restaurants to practice the following guidelines. And of course, then they have the standard list of, occupation, limits on occupation, keeping people apart, who's got to wear a mask and who doesn't have to wear a mask, et cetera, et cetera. That section does not explicitly say, municipalities, you can make these mandatory if you want. But it doesn't say the opposite either. And I've interpreted when the governor is silent on these issues, I've interpreted, and most other municipalities have interpreted it to mean that a municipality can act, right? So legally, if you wanted to impose these requirements, make them mandatory, that's fine. The other section in the governor's ordinance that may have some relevance to us are emergency guidelines for gatherings. Again, these are guidelines, not mandatory, but they're a list of guidelines directed towards large events. There's no real cutoff in the size. It's just, larger events. And again, not surprisingly, they have occupancy limits, who's going to be wearing a mask, and social distancing guidelines. And again, there's nothing in here about whether municipalities can make them mandatory or not. So my interpretation is it's open season if we wanted to impose any such guidelines. And that's about it. There's nothing other than the mask ordinance that impacts businesses in general. So there's not really any state rules governing general businesses other than the mask. Okay. Yep.
Just a point of clarification. You said that the state has no mask requirements. Is that really what you mean?
Yeah, they are not mandatory.
Anywhere.
They're just guideline anywhere.
I can go indoors and eat and stand in line and not have to wear a mask, according to the state. Is that what you're saying?
According to the state. Now, most municipalities still have mandatory masks. Yeah.
I understand. I just want to make sure that I understood exactly what you said. And the reason why I say it is I just came back from a 3-day trip to Texas where it's all no holds barred. And it was really strange to go everywhere and see nobody with a mask. And so that was just different. And so I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
We're in that situation now, as far as the governor is concerned.
It's all guidelines, including,
Okay.
yes, it's all guidelines everywhere, nothing mandatory.
Joe,
Yes.
you mentioned that in government offices, they are required to wear a mask, but you also said there are a lot of exceptions. Can you give an example of some of those
Yeah.
exceptions?
Yeah, and let me correct myself. I mean, I didn't really, it's guidelines. It's not mandatory in government offices. The exceptions are similar to what we already have in our ordinance. In fact, the ordinance we did more or less duplicates all those exceptions. So it's, for children under the age of 2, people who are hearing impaired, people engaged in eating, people engaged in strenuous activity, and that sort of thing. Just
Okay.
kind of the standard stuff we've seen throughout.
All right.
Marianne, go ahead. I had a question, but you go ahead. You're done.
Diane.
Stephanie or Mr. Mayor, have we been hearing anything from the restaurant operators, including the resort, about feeling that they are overly restricted at this point?
I have not, Dan.
John, have you,
I can't say though, it's comments, but nothing,
yeah.
you know. I don't think it was so much, Dan, I don't know if it's so much restrictive as it is confusing. And that, and you, after reflecting on what Joe just said, you can see why people are confused. That's the point. And I think that's the issue.
And with regards to that, I agree. For better or worse, we've kind of carried this emergency ordinance through for a year now. I think it's high time to get it cleaned up, probably get rid of all these whereas clauses. I think it's important to remember too, something we were trying to do was reiterate the state orders in our own ordinance, which is not legally necessary. It was done just for ease of reference for our citizens. But that's a difficult process, and it makes it a lot more complicated than it really has to be. I mean, I would strongly urge council to let the state do the state thing and let us do ours, without trying to duplicate what the state's doing in our own ordinance.
Joe, are you obviously, the Foley and the other municipalities in Charleston, what are they doing? I read something about Charleston, but then it said that they're going to revisit it the 13th of May. So where are they at? Where are those other communities at?
I think you stated it well. They're all at the point of, is it time to make mask coverings mandatory or voluntary? I think for the most part, none of them have made that move yet. Frankly, that hadn't even been brought up on Foley. I think we're pretty comfortable with having the mask requirement in place. But it's notable that Charleston is starting to take a look at this too, especially in light of the fact of how restrictive the city of Charleston's been over the year. They've been pretty aggressive on a lot of fronts. So the fact that they may be moving to consider lifting mandatory mask restrictions is of interest.
So Joe, if for example, we decided that we wanted to make all of our mask related items voluntary or optional, whatever the right word is, can a business then still make it mandatory to wear a mask onto their premises?
Certainly, yes. And in fact, that's exactly what the governor's order says.
Okay. So one of the questions as it pertains just to the mask, not the social distancing or capacity, but just the mask, is really a question of whether as a town, we want to have any aspects of that be mandatory or conform with what the governor has said and make them all optional from a municipality standpoint.
Yeah, and if we're just gonna make it optional or a guideline, we may want to seriously consider just not having anything other than, say anything about it, because the governor's suggestion is already in place. But or we can duplicate what I think the guidelines that the governor has created, setting aside whether they're mandatory or voluntary, are pretty good ones. They've got a good list of exceptions and they're appropriate in a lot of what they do. But we might want to think about, if we're going to make it a guideline ourselves, whether we need to actually effectuate that or not, because Or, you know, it could just be, we adopt and encourage the public to follow the state's guidelines, period.
Yeah.
Or we could just, you know, we could set the whole thing out and have our own set of guidelines.
But Joe,
And let me say, that's kind of why we're having this meeting, so I can draft something that we can put on the agenda. It doesn't have to be final, obviously, but it's, you know, I'd like to get some idea of where we're heading.
but at the least, Joe, from Stephanie's memo, the 5 bullets that are on this memo with possibly a preamble that just talked about, you know, council's continued concern relative to safety and well-being of the community. We wish to have these 5 bullets in place for 30 days. The document could be almost that simple.
Yeah,
And-
I mean, we can, I'm looking at it right now.
I mean, this gets away from the year end, it gets away from the state, it gets away from everything. And then just, I'm not suggesting this, I'm not making a motion, I'm just getting it on the table.
I
But
think
it could be
maybe,
something that simple.
you know, but this bullet points, one of them is the exemptions. And you do have to have a list of exemptions for the mask. So that's gonna add some verbiage.
Mary Ann,
Yes.
you've been trying to get a question in.
I do have a question about the masks. Most of the questions that I get are regarding wearing masks, and I'd be interested in how my fellow council members feel about that. You know, if you have people that are already vaccinated and they're working, I'm talking about employees now, they're working in an area where everyone there is vaccinated. People are thinking, well, why do I have to wear a mask? And I guess the only concern about not having a mandatory mask wearing is when we get all our vacationers here. Some of them are coming from states that are still having spikes in COVID. And it worries me from that regard. I'd also state that at the PGA, I know that they are requiring people to wear the masks outside. So it's a standard that they've set up, and it's been in cooperation with MUSC. And I'm wondering if indeed we should continue with the mask wearing for another month or another 90 days, or, you know, have some latitude with it, as Joe had mentioned.
I'll jump in, Mary Ann, since you're looking for feedback. I've been in 2 restaurants in the last, sounds odd, but I haven't been in many restaurants lately. But I've been in a resort restaurant this last week, and I've been in a club facility restaurant, sit-down restaurant. In both cases, they're following the procedures, including quite a bit of spacing between tables, okay? No one's complaining, no one's objecting to it. It doesn't seem to be a problem. I will say, getting a dinner reservation on the island almost anywhere, restaurants or clubs, is difficult right now. There are a lot of people wanting to get out, and there's limited capacity. That's why I'm surprised we haven't heard much from restaurants. So I do think we want to study the restaurant situation, but I wouldn't want to make any changes there unless we had really had a good dialogue with a resort and other operators. Where are their heads right now? As it goes to masks, Mary Ann, I'm not in favor of lifting the mandatory mask rule on the town at this point. I think people are used to it. The PGA is going to have it in place even if you're outdoors. I like our mask rule. I think many citizens would be disappointed if it got changed at this point.
Thank you, Bill.
My thoughts.
Thank you, Dan. And I do agree with the restaurant situation. It does not seem like people are demanding to have the space reduced to a normal.
No, it's
number.
actually quite a pleasant experience right
It
now.
is.
You don't feel it.
It really is. You're
Yeah.
not right next
Once
to
you can get in.
Yeah, once you get in. I mean, you have to call more than a week in advance if you plan to have dinner out somewhere.
And you know, the truth of the matter is that pressure is just going to accelerate as we move into tourist season. And so,
Well, I'd just like to make a comment about the population. I was looking at the Kika report from March. There were 55,000 more vehicles went through the gate in March this year than last year.
Oh.
55,000.
It's a lot of trouble.
I'm not really surprised at that with the number of people
No.
that stayed here and the the fact that it's transient population, tourist as opposed to meetings and stuff. That number really doesn't, it's a big
Well,
number, but I'm not shocked at all that it's so much more.
I think it verifies everything we're saying. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard to get restaurant reservations.
Yeah, yeah.
Why? There's that many more people here.
So, my thought on this mask thing is that I've been vaccinated now since the 2 weeks after would be the 26th of March. And, I don't hesitate to put a mask on almost as soon as I step out of my car if I'm going somewhere. My wife and I both wear them all the time when we go to grocery stores, restaurants, wherever we are. If we are getting out of our car, we're starting to put our mask on. And it's become just a habit, I don't think I consciously think of it as a safeguard. It's just a habit that's been formed. And I'm with Dan. I would hesitate to change our mask ordinance at least no sooner than the 1st of June. I think we should be consistent at least through the PGA championship with all of these people coming from it's only 10,000 spectators, but there's still going to be a ton of people that have not been here before. I just think it'd be a good idea to keep the mask portion in place. And I would support maybe simplifying the language, Joe, if you think it needs some simplification. But the gist of what our ordinance is, I would support leaving it just like it is.
I agree with you, and I appreciate your input.
well, I went through it pretty extensively, and I don't know if you can see this, but I've got it all marked up. But not a one of the things that I would change in this document has to do with wearing of the mask. It's all about ancillary stuff, in terms of
Right.
language. It doesn't apply anymore, or tightening up some things. But it's got nothing to do with the fact that we should be wearing a mask. We should still be wearing a mask, and we will be wearing a mask until such time as the CDC says, hey, we don't need to be wearing a mask anymore, in my opinion.
I agree with that, Scott.
Okay, Joe, does that give you what getting back to my earlier question then? So with those bullets and the continuation of what we have in place, but just making it something that would say that this is in response to the health, welfare, safety of our community, we're just going to have this ordinance in place. Can we say something like that? Not make reference to an emergency ordinance or anything, and just have a simple document that just outlines what we've talked about and have those things in place.
Well, yes. I mean, I can take out all the whereas stuff. We're raising another point here that we probably need to address. For better or worse, I mean, the other thing that's been happening in the last 4 or 5 months is that a lot of municipalities, including Kiowa, have this is no longer an emergency ordinance. It was a normally passed ordinance. So I don't know if we want to just treat this as an amendment, if we want to stick with that so we don't have to reread it every 60 days. Do you see what I'm saying?
I'm not worried about rereading it 60, that doesn't trouble me. I don't know how the rest of them feel, but it's just so that it's explainable, that we've separated ourselves from so much that's included in this. We just have this in place for 60 days and we'll see where we're at,
Okay.
4th of July, I guess.
Yeah, I actually think, Mayor and Joe, that's a good idea because I don't think the community is ready to think of this in any other way other than the emergency we're in. And I think reviewing it every 60 days isn't a bad idea. I do think cleaning the language up is good. I probably wouldn't suggest we do much with the restaurant distancing and all of that unless we've heard from the resort and others that there's a real need to do that. So I don't mind the 60 days. I really like the idea of making it simple and sort of one page-ish to the extent we can. And then let's look at it.
I don't know, we're gonna get down to one.
Maybe like 1.5 pages.
It's like real tiny.
Can I ask a question just for my own clarification? Because I do see this as being possibly confusing for visitors or even residents. So currently on page 3 of our current ordinance, we state that all persons, including employees, entering or waiting to enter a restaurant, business, club, or association must wear face covering. So what's happening is that people are wearing their face covering when they're entering or waiting, but when they get inside, they're removing it. And then on page 4, we specifically state that employees and patrons should be required to wear masks or face coverings, but we're only talking about restaurants or establishments that possess a state permit to sell alcohol. So your retail stores, that wouldn't apply. So then if you go into retail stores, someone may say, well, I wore one entering or waiting, but once I get inside, I remove it. So I'm not sure if our ordinance is not really clear on that now. And maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but I do hear a lot of confusion on that. And maybe we need to fix that if our intent, for instance, well, because if I'm just going to use as an example, we wouldn't have to worry about, for instance, Harris Teeter, because they do have a permit. Well, they don't have a permit to sell alcohol, but they have a permit to sell beer and wine. So
Make
go
a
ahead.
suggestion that what we do is just for the mask requirement, that we just say it's applicable to any indoor public space.
Yeah, that would be good.
And, you know, let's not create all these restaurants do this and businesses do that.
That's my point, I guess, is that right now it's kind of all over the place and no one really knows what to do. And they take it off when they get inside because our language is a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, I think the idea of inside any public space basically says you walk through the door, you wear a mask until you walk out of the door.
I wouldn't want to go to Harris Teeter unless there was that rule in
I
place.
know, me too.
I will say I went to the dentist this morning and during the procedure, I had to take my mask off. Other than that, I had to have my mask on in the waiting room and elsewhere. So that was fine.
Joe and Stephanie, a question, and I maybe have this wrong, but getting back to the restaurants, we make reference to 6 foot. Didn't something come out of CDC or somebody that says that it was really 3 foot? Or did I misread that? Is that?
I'm not aware of that.
I'm not
Actually,
aware of that.
The CDC has been all over the map about that.
I did hear that recently.
Maybe 3 weeks ago, they said that. And then I think there was something in the news yesterday or Sunday that said that 6 feet and 60 feet might be the same number, that you might need to be really far apart. So I don't think anybody really knows. And the 60 feet thing came from very closed space with very poor ventilation. And that was the topic that they were talking about there. But clearly they've said that when you're outdoors, you do not need to be wearing a mask. So I think that if you're waiting to get into a restaurant or waiting to get into Harris Teeter, you don't need to be standing there wearing your mask.
But for,
I think.
but for schools,
Go ahead.
that's it's 6 foot.
Yes, that is the current recommendation. But like I say, there as they get more and more data, there's more and more conflicting noise out there about that.
Okay.
I will say that they did say let me get my data here. Their guidance dated April 2, 2021 says that phonite transmission is so low as to be negligible. So they can go ahead and put ketchup bottles back on tables. And their latest recommendations also allow vaccinated people to gather indoors with other fully vaccinated people without wearing masks or staying 6 feet apart. So if you know you're in a venue with everybody's vaccinated, hug and kiss all you want.
Well, can I just to drill down? I mean, since I kind of got a feeling how council feels on the mask or part of this, I feel pretty good about that. So turning to restaurants and additional requirements above and beyond the mask one, which is what you're talking about. How does council feel? Do they want to maintain our little, we have a few restrictions in place now, 6 feet away from diners at other tables, 8 customers per table, unless from the same family, no standing or congregating in the bar. So
I'd leave it alone, yeah.
I would leave it, I'd leave it like it is, at least for the next couple of months.
Yep.
I
For
agree.
60 days,
Yeah,
let's
exactly.
review it then.
Yep.
Nobody seems uncomfortable with it. They're all marching to the orders now. The restaurants have adopted.
Automatically.
You know, the complaint that Roger has, and it's a widespread one, he can't get labor. You know, if he opened more tables, he might not be able to get a waiter to serve those tables.
Okay, well, what I'll do is when I draft what we're going to consider, I'll have those restrictions in there. And of course, we can get into we can debate the niceties of it at that time.
Okay.
Is that
Joe?
fair enough? Yeah.
Joe, one thing, you said in order to simplify the face covering to basically state that we're indoors in any public space, you have to wear your face covering. I think we would still obviously have, do we need to make for restaurants state that if you're, before in our ordinance we had, if you're drinking or sitting at the table, you're not required to wear your face covering. We had something like
That's
that.
generally an exemption.
Pardon me?
That's one of the exemptions.
Exemption.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
Wear
that's right. Yep. Okay.
And Joe, you had said earlier that even though that's not mandatory, that the 6 foot distancing for the diners, that's still a guideline from the state?
It is.
Okay. So
Yes,
nothing.
well, let me make sure. I'm looking right at it. Yes, it's still in there.
Okay. So
It's a recommendation. We're
It is.
making it mandatory, but the state just has a recommendation. Okay.
we're consistent. Okay, we're consistent in that.
Well, no, Mayor,
No,
If
not
I'm
consistent with
understanding-
the state. We're consistent in that we're making mandatory what they're calling guidelines.
yeah.
Correct.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. And I think I think that's fine. I mean, I think that just is our policy and practice and sorry, it's my brother. I think that's fine. But at least I think it'll be easier to explain.
Yeah.
And we'll stay the course for, a while.
So then kind of the third area in our current emergency ordinance is this a little bit more unusual, where we've got essential businesses, which is a definition from a very old governor's order, but grocery stores and pharmacies basically are still subject to a mandatory, a maximum occupancy rate, and must have social distancing practices, and must, have sanitation practices. So almost making essential businesses subject to the same rules as a restaurant. So my question to council would be, do we want to continue to impose mandatory restrictions beyond the mask, right? We're really talking about occupancy and social distancing on businesses in general on the island.
Is that part and parcel then also speaking to the X number of customers per 1,000 square feet or 10% of the fire marshal, whichever is least?
Yes, that's the
And
occupancy.
that's only for essential businesses. That's not for everyone.
I can go
Well,
into Molly and Scout though and have as many people as I want in there. But if I go to Vincent's, I've got to be restricted to only 4 people.
Right, because like a retail store, right, yeah, because retail stores we didn't have it, Joe, as retail stores did not have, because they were never defined as essential business.
that's right. And
So, yeah,
but to me, that's part of the problem that's complicating things is what's an essential business. I mean, if we want to just apply this to say grocery stores and pharmacies, that's fine. I can, define essential businesses. Or are we going to apply it to all retail?
Yeah, I like essential businesses. And the reason, Scott, it doesn't bother me that I could go to Scott and Molly's or whatever it's called, is I have the option to go in there or not go in there if it looks crowded. But if I need drugs or groceries, I've got to go in there. I would suggest we limit it and not define it as essential businesses because that's confusing. I would define it as grocery stores and pharmacies and limit
How
that.
about a convenience store? Is that a grocery store?
Exactly.
mhm.
A gas
Yes,
station? I think the problem is you might, in the attempt to make it simple, you may
Yeah.
actually confuse
Make
the
it
issue.
confusing. Mhm.
Essentially, when the governor had this order, you guys recall essential business, during that time, everything that was allowed to stay open was defined as essential business. So our gas station with the convenience store piece to it, they were allowed to stay open. If you had to close, you were defined as non-essential. Or you had some businesses that were able to apply for an exemption through the state. So even though they may have fallen, that we may have defined them as non-essential, if they were able to get permission from the state, I think Commerce, to say, no, I'm essential because of this, then they were allowed to stay open and then they were classified as essential business. And we have maybe 1 or 2 stores like that on the island where we may have defined them as non-essential, but they got the exception and they were able to stay open. So then all of a sudden they became essential.
But now with everybody being open, it's difficult to use that same essential definition because we don't have that other delineation of open or not open.
I
Well,
would strongly suggest that we try to define essential businesses by just, groceries, pharmacies, convenience stores, maybe banks, maybe medical offices are subject to these.
Yes.
Liquor stores.
Well,
I don't think they're essential, are they?
Yes,
Yeah.
Depends.
about
Well,
5 o'clock, they're essential.
yeah,
I like the idea then of just a short list. And I think it's really just grocery stores, drugstores, convenience stores. I don't think you need to say medical offices because they're all small and they are very good about managing their waiting rooms. I'd go to convenience stores, grocery stores, and what did I miss? And drugstores.
Yeah.
Drugstores.
Remember though, whatever we put in there, that means that it has to be enforceable.
Right.
That just pause on that for a moment. I mean, I think the masks that we can continue to emphasize and the distancing, but we start getting into these occupancies, that means that we're going to have to hold people accountable for, whatever 6 occupants or 7.
And to go back to something John said earlier, I think all of us have now become habituated to wearing a mask and staying 6 feet away from everybody. So I don't see the need to treat one group of businesses different than another, since everybody is already in that habit. And you see people still doing the dance when they get too close, they'll kind of
Right.
move away from one another.
Yeah, I mean, I was in the hardware store today and they don't have any stickers on the floor. They don't have any signs that say socially distanced practices are enforced or anything. And they had 2 registers open and there was 1 queue to supply people going into each register and everybody was 6 feet apart. It was, I mean, it's like you said, Scott, it's just a habit. That's just how we've started to handle things like that. So maybe we don't need to be, but so,
I think the lighter the hand we have going forward, the better off it is for everyone.
yeah.
Because we are trying to slowly transition back to a different world than what we've been living in the last year and a half.
Council members, may I please just get some clarification when we were talking about, the restaurants and the 6-foot separation and the occupancy limit, et cetera. As an example, Sandcastle, they have various venues, or in their venue, they may have various events, catering events, et cetera. Would we define them as a restaurant and have to follow the same restrictions that we're talking about?
Yes.
Or would you call them large gatherings? Like a wedding reception?
Yeah, we don't have restrictions on that. Because it's, so is that considered like exempt? Because then that would be the same for the conference center for the resort. If they're having, catered events there. Because that's an event venue that has food, and are we then exempting them so they don't have to follow in terms of the dining and the posting?
To put it another way, do we want to include with restaurants any establishments that serve food?
I think so, yes.
I don't know. I think that we're entering an area that then again becomes a little overcomplicated.
Right.
Use the conference center as an example. If you put this in place so that it affects their catered events, how about if they're just having a talk by somebody? Does the audience then have to, because it's in that same facility, do they have to be 6 feet apart? Or is only 6 feet apart if you're eating? Well, I think, maybe, I don't know. I'm almost of the opinion that we just have a mask ordinance.
Well, I guess the other alternative is to add a paragraph for large gatherings.
Yeah, but I'm not, John, I'm not sure you meant this, but I still think we need an occupancy limit for places like Harris Teeter.
Well, that's going to be covered in the essential business.
So this is like, a venue, venues, it could be at conference center or a Sandcastle. Say someone's having a wedding and they have a catered event. Are we defining that as a restaurant when technically they're probably not?
Or do we want
Let's
to
say
put
that-
any rules on it at all?
Right.
Let's say Roger Warren is hosting a cocktail party the week of the PGA and is serving heavy hors d'oeuvres. Is that now all of a sudden subject to those limits?
Well, that's outside and people will be masked.
May
But you
not.
still got limits in terms of how many people can be there, how many
We're
spacing.
going to have tables sitting around. So, there's a whole, I worry that if we try to get too specific, we're going to just overcomplicate the thing.
Well, the state has guidelines on large events, as I
Right.
mentioned.
As do we.
We've never really
have-
had
no.
guidelines on large events.
No, we fell to the state.
Yeah. I can put a section in that would be simple, be similar to what the state has for your consideration.
That's probably a good plan, because then we've got something in front of us that we can work from.
Yeah.
I think that it sounds that way, yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that there's anything wrong in holding to mandatory requirements that we wish to hold to
Right,
and articulating guidelines that are consistent with what the state has.
I agree.
I don't see any.
Well,
You just have to be careful when they're mandatory. When we're saying they're mandatory, we have to be ready to enforce them. But if we're getting confused, or not confused, but if we're having this discussion ourselves relative to what constitutes a mandatory requirement as compared to a guideline, just think what the owners are going to be going through. Again, getting back to that issue of enforceability. And
well, can I just point out, I think that's a very important issue. And I think that's one that, we can get to the council meeting where the first draft is considered. And it's pretty easy to say, well, we should make this a guideline, not mandatory. You know what I mean? And then I can kind of do that on the fly, so to speak, as long as the language is in front of us.
Yep.
There's no question it's easier to react to something that's concrete and written as opposed to making all sorts of hypotheticals.
Exactly.
I think when we consider all of these things, we should also be thinking about what the resort has been doing, what the partners are doing, their relationship with MUSC in deciding whether they can do this and they can do that. Because I don't think we want to fly in the face of what they've been told they should do and make something easier.
Yeah. I do think it would be very helpful. I agree with you, Mary Ann, that we need to reach out to probably, at a minimum, those two entities
Right.
who operate these kind of facilities,
Mhm.
just get a sense of where their heads are right now. Roger's a pretty sensible guy, and he's got his plate full right now with stuff. We don't want to get in the way there. On the other hand, he may find it helpful to continue to operate the way he's operating.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm
Also,
saying,
I would be interested to know what the South Carolina Restaurant Association is now saying. What is their stance?
Here's your guidelines now. They changed them from recommendations. So,
Okay.
so what you see with regards to some of the things we had, it was a requirement through the state. They did the SC Accelerate, and then they changed that from requirement to recommendations that they strongly encourage and recommend. So they no longer have requirements in place, but we've kept some of those requirements. We kept some of the requirements in place where they now made them as strongly encouraged.
Okay.
And then with regards to the, I think the resort and Kika and the partners, how we currently have it in place, we're not making it more restrictive for them. And I think, and from what I've been told and talked to, is that they're still going to follow MUSC guidelines back to business. So for instance, even, I think it helps if what we have right now, I have not heard that it's impeded them to be able to do business the way they're doing it. I think what I'm hearing sometimes is that when we make changes to this ordinance, it becomes very confusing for their staff to enforce because they don't really know what they should or should not enforce because it's a little confusing. Yes, Mr. Moppet.
No, I was just.
You're waving. I thought you were holding your hand up.
I
The
do
sign
have
language.
Hey,
a-
Mary Ann.
the partners and the resort are getting caught up on weddings too and events that were scheduled before. So they're going to be facing their recommendations constantly as these previously scheduled events are going to be scheduled.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just saying that their rules, they're going to be using their guidelines all the time.
Yep. Okay.
Joe, did you get a clear direction from council on the emergency maximum occupancy rate? I know it's a central business. I kind of understood that you'd like to define a central business, but I didn't really get if we wanted to keep that in place or not.
Well,
I was just going to keep it in as a mandatory. Yes, and of course, again, the caveat being it's up for a vote. But yes, I'm gonna basically reiterate the occupancy rate, the social distancing practices, and the sanitation steps. So it'll be similarly worded. The core of paragraph 8.
Okay.
Our current paragraph 8. I'm going to bring up another very peripheral issue, but this is as good a time as any. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. We've been involved in an appeal. Judge Strauch this past fall ruled that the municipal court did not have jurisdiction over violations, ordinance violations subject to a civil fine. And that was a ruling I disagreed with. And it came out of the fact that our original emergency ordinance had civil instead of criminal fines, which is, there's a lot of reasons for that, but that's what most municipalities were doing. So we switched it to criminal fines and we appealed his decision. Well, just last week, we won that appeal, which is good. It's good for all municipalities, frankly. So I would be inclined to switch back to civil fines now that that issue has been cleared up. And if it goes in front of municipal court, the municipal court will hear it now. So just a minor technical issue, but
I would agree with that. That's good.
Yeah.
But
And Joe,
Yeah.
I had already
100%.
changed it, Joe, on my version. I had
Okay.
already changed it because I knew that we won the appeal. So I was just gonna have us just go ahead and make that change.
make sure Sandy knows this, right?
yes, I've been in touch with them.
Good.
Still, the judge has asked for a longer order, which I prepared and provided to her late last week, and she'll sign that hopefully in a few days. So I think I'll
And are we
leave
gonna-
in,
We're gonna do this for 60 days out, Joe, instead of. end of
sounds that
December?
way.
Okay,
Sounds that way, and I'll have to do the effective date where that all works.
Joe, just pause there for a second. I'm sorry to go back to where we left it. That executive order, I'm reading it again. It's referencing the governor's executive order 2020-2021. What does it say right now? It just talks about, or does it even reference emergency maximum?
Well, this is the problem. 2021 is gone, right? 2020-21 has been superseded.
Right. So when we talk about occupancy rates, what's our basis for talking about occupancy rates? If the emergency order that promulgated this way back when is gone.
Well, it's the same as the rest of it. We have this, I mean, there is still some guidelines in place for large gatherings. I guess there's nothing in the governor's order that is generally applicable to essential businesses anymore. But from a legal standpoint, it's my opinion and the opinion of most other municipal counsel or municipal attorneys that because the state has said nothing on that we are entitled to act, that we have the legal authority, we are not preempted, and we can do stuff like this.
I guess I sort of understand that, but let's just say we have our masks, we have the restaurants, we have all that kind of stuff. The owner of Harris Teeter says, the owner of, that's maybe too big, but with Harris Teeter says, where'd you guys come up with this? Where did you come up with that I can't have more than whatever the occupancy rate is in for Harris Teeter as a grocery store? Time has passed. What's our basis that we're going to now enforce something? If it's all
The city's general police powers.
No, not the.
well, I think, Mayor, one of the things that we can say that even though the governor has lifted the order as the municipality, we felt from a public health safety standpoint to keep it in place because we only have one grocery store, and with the fact of the matter is that becomes very crowded, and we're trying to continue that.
Maybe I'm not saying it well. At least in the others, there are guidelines that by him being quiet, it allows us to make them mandatory as compared to the guidelines. In the case of this emergency order and occupancy, he doesn't say anything. There's not even a guideline. That's all I'm saying, Stephanie. So I mean, I can argue in the state's guidelines, we as a town have decided to make it more restrictive and more conservative and making it mandatory. But I'm just talking here. If there's nothing, then they'll say, well, where did it come up from? And we're going to have to say, well, remember way back when.
No, it doesn't. That's not. This is an issue. It's called preemption. And whether municipalities have a generally wide open space that they can operate it in under the police powers. And we can do everything we do is pursuant to our police powers. And so all this falls under that, and we can do it unless the state says we cannot do it. Right? So the governor, in his order, he could have put in one of these orders on any of these issues, municipalities, you cannot do this, right? He's never done that. So in fact, when an issue or an area of regulation is completely removed from his emergency ordinance, from his executive order, like the essential business stuff, we actually have a better argument that we're not preempted, because the governor hadn't said anything about what the state thinks, yay or nay. But really the most crucial thing is he hasn't said, municipalities, you cannot regulate essential businesses. And he has to say that. It's called conflict preemption, and then we couldn't touch that area, probably. I mean, there's some debate there too, but.
Okay, but if we're going to have this, as you're thinking about it over the next week, give us something that says, this is why, relate it to something.
Could we not relate it back to the governor's original executive order, even though it's no longer there?
But what Joe is saying is we don't have to relate it to anything because it's not precluded from our abilities. We can just start from zero and say.
I understand that. I understand that, but I'm just saying, if you're going to argue the case to an owner of Harris Teeter, you just don't want to say we have police powers. I mean,
okay, I think
it's called the Home Rule Act.
Right.
And let me answer it this way, because I obviously I've looked at this a lot, and I'll put it this way. The state's power to enact this is under our general police powers as granted by the Home Rule Act, which says we can act to protect the health and safety of our citizens. And it's also authorized by the statute that creates the emergency ordinances, that allows us to pass emergency ordinances to address emergencies. So it specifically says to protect the health and safety of citizens. So those two statutes standing alone give us ample, and in fact, I mean, this is the problem with people who would suggest that we don't have that power. We have that power in two, not one, but two state statutes that are quite clear that the city has very broad powers unless the state says you can't do it.
I'm not questioning.
Joe.
All I'm questioning is the logic. I'm questioning the rationale. I'm questioning what's our basis for argument. That's all I'm saying.
Policy. Well,
No, that's not what he's asking, Joe. What you're saying is absolutely correct. But what John, if I understand you correctly, is saying, where did you come up with these numbers?
Yeah.
Did you just pull them out of the air, or are they based in some science or some previous? That's what he's asking. He's not debating whether or not.
I'm sorry.
Well,
Well,
because we're going to get down there and give fines. I mean, that's the point about this emergency. We're going to get down there and say, you have to stop. We're going to give fines, all within our power, all within our prerogative. And when we levy them, and then someone's going to say, where did you come up with that? And
I got you. I'm sorry.
That's all I'm saying.
Well,
Give us some.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to go back. I mean, basically this language, it does arise from an older state executive order. I have to go back and see if they relied on CDC
I think,
guidelines.
Joe, if I recall, it was based on the Restaurant Association that came up with that information. And so that's what the governor used.
I'm sorry, yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't but yes.
Yes,
That is,
Dr. Parker.
Could you not just change the language to simply say, and let me get it here. All essential businesses originally defined by the governor's executive order 2021-21 must comply with the occupancy standards that were defined in that order. Just leave it at that. You don't have to say that the order's changed or it's no longer in place. You've provided a place to say, this is the definition of where we came up with these numbers.
Well,
I mean, I don't know. I'm just simply trying to give John something that when somebody says, where did you come up with this? I say, well, originally they were defined by the governor as this, and we decided to keep those same definitions for the time being.
Well, it's not just John, it's all of us because we're.
All of us. I'm okay. But you're the one who gets most of the emails.
Yeah, but we're going to
Yeah.
enforce it. It's going to be, Stephanie and the others that are just going to have to say, this is where this came from. And someone will say, but didn't he rescind those?
All
And I
right.
say, yes, but we're,
I'm looking back at that old order. They are guidances promulgated by the department.
It was the Department of Commerce or something, or SC Accelerate.
Yeah, I gotta
The restaurant.
roll back up and see where they define department. Jeez. I mean, I can track, shoot.
Is there any, while he's looking, and we can maybe have that for a meeting on Tuesday, is there anything else? Because I do want to give you guys time to log out and drive here to Town Hall for your 3 o'clock Ways and Means meeting.
South Carolina Department of Commerce,
Yeah, it was Department of
where
Commerce.
these originated.
And I think they were following the SC Accelerate, I thought, but
I suspect they are. I think if I
Yes.
dug in the internet on their website, that it would say something along those lines.
I think that's where it came from.
So I just want
Sorry
to
for
be clear now.
misinterpreting that question.
I just want to be clear now, speaking from a scientific point of view. The Department of Commerce is defining what the appropriate social distances are for a disease process.
What they did, Dr. Parker, I know, is that they referenced the Restaurant Association came up with some guidelines. And I think then if you wanted an exemption or something, yeah, you had to go through Department of Commerce as a business.
I just find that interesting.
Relative to Stephanie's comment about our 3 o'clock meeting, those of you on the island, give yourself an extra 5 or 10 minutes because of the mulch truck. Guess is it's still operating.
Is there anything else, Joe, that you wanted to?
There was, wait, all right, we'll leave the fines, the net fines will be paid to a nonprofit or charitable organization. I assume that says.
I'm guessing, yeah, I'm guessing that would stay. Yes, that'll stay.
I think that's, I really appreciate the guidance instead of me trying to kind of guess what direction we're heading in. This is much easier. And I think when we have our first reading, it'll be a lot easier to get through it.
oh, this will be another situation. What's the process, Joe? So.
Oh, that's right.
Will we
We'll have
give
one
that-
reading. I'm sorry, we'll have one reading because we're going back to using the emergency ordinance statute. So it will be one reading.
And we repeal this?
Well, yes, we're going to repeal it.
And replace,
Yes. I'm not going to, see, that was what I really didn't want to do, was try to do a markup
no, I understand.
of what we have, because that's going to be a mess. We're just going to repeal it in whole and replace it in whole.
Okay. Is that everybody that's good with everybody?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. All right. That's it. Thank you all. Stephanie, do you need a motion to adjourn? Good.
Yes, you'll need a motion, Mayor.
I move we adjourn, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, second,
Second.
second.